needed. I can kind of see what all the fuss is about now. I didn't realise there would be quite such a large selection. So, please do enjoy as we go. So I'm going to present basically two parts of my PhD. The sort of latter half that's got a bit more modelling detail in it, but I'll maybe briefly talk about what I did previous to that. I managed to get the date right, did I? Yeah, I think you got the date right. That's good. That's a good start. Let me close the door. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions as we go, please do ask. I don't know how much people's backgrounds. This is kind of macroeconomic modelling, I guess, looking at the UK. There will be three parts roughly to the talk. The first two parts are really, there's a bit of modelling involved in the first two parts, but it was mostly sort of manipulation of a database and some sort of mapping of different sectors in order to then do the third part, which was the actual carbon tax, the implementation of that in a model. The reason that I wanted to introduce or try to simulate a carbon tax was originally stimulated by the first chapter of my PhD, which looked at the Committee on Climate Change in the UK, which was set up in 2008. I'm sure most of you will be aware of their work. It was really, hopefully, I think the first piece of work that sort of looked at theoretically why they existed and try to understand why they functioned the way they did, and directly comparing them as an independent body to the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, who also have a similar role in trying to, as an independent body from government, provide some sort of credibility of policy over a longer time frame. So where it's necessary with climate change to have, because of the length of the problem and the uncertainty involved, it's necessary to try to have certainty of policy over, a 40-year time frame, because you've got investments in renewables which will have a lifespan of 20 to 30 years. You've also got to try to decarbonise the economy over a lengthy period of time. Anyway, so one of the I guess conclusions of that original chapter was that it would be better if the Committee on Climate Change were given control of a policy instrument. At the moment they're really just a monitoring body, but the emphasis would be on the way that the Monetary Policy Committee has control of the interest rates in order to sort of affect inflation and have some price stability in the economy. Here, if you had control of a policy instrument, and the most obvious one would be something like the carbon tax. So I was already kind of looking at the UK on a spatial scale, so I thought it'd be interesting to then try to implement what exactly would be the effects of implementing a tax. But so there was two main problems with that first. One, I didn't think the sort of data that was available and the types of modelling that I was going to use managed to capture the relevant policy that was already there. So I wanted to try in some way capture what was already happening at the UK level, and obviously the EU emissions trading scheme covers roughly about 50% of UK emissions. So I wanted to try to capture that somehow. I did some work on that first, and also this is the type of modelling that I was using, which was input-output and CGE models, were very, there's not a lot of technological detail. It's very rich in terms of the economic detail there, but in terms of technology, it's not particularly unlike, say, the energy systems models, it's almost the opposite end of the scale in the fact that the sort of energy systems are really very basic. So I wanted to try to at least identify between sort of high and low carbon technologies within the model, which wasn't possible given the original database. So I'll basically try to briefly go through the first two and then give you a detail on the actual carbon tax simulations. So the method and the database that I used originally is an input-output database. So an input-output database is basically a set of accounts for a year. The way that you have a set of national accounts, I don't know how familiar people are with this. And basically it gives you a snapshot of the economy in a single year. It includes all, quite a high level of economic sectors and the sort of purchases from each sector. The purchases of each sector from each other. So it gives you sort of all the inter-industry transactions in the economy, as well as all the purchases and sales by households and government and imports and exports. So then you have a sort of an overall GDP figure for that. So it's normally a set of 1 year, basically. The set of accounts is for a single year. And you have, so you have your intermediate purchases, you have your final demand, which will be the actual final demand for goods and services, as opposed to the demand for intermediate goods and services, which are then used to produce more goods in the economy. And then you then have your value added, which will be taxes, payments for labour, and that sort of thing. So here's a very high level IO table. This isn't the one that I used, but this is just one that has 3 sectors in it. This was Scotland. So as you can see, you've got the primary construction sector, manufacturing, utilities, and distribution and transport and services, and that accounts for everything in the Scottish economy in 2004. And it's just basically a matrix where you're seeing primary and construction sector purchasing 3,513 million from itself, and then you can see manufacturing and utilities are purchasing that from primary construction. Basically, that's how you would read the table. You then have your final demand here for primary and construction sector, your final demand for manufacturing, and obviously, as you'd expect, services and that sort of thing are a large part of our Scottish and UK, same as UK national economies. So this is used as the primary input to a database to the computable general equilibrium modelling, which I was going to use for the carbon tax. And at this stage, I'll just give you a bit more of a background. So you can also use the IO database to create a model, a very simple model itself of the economy, which is a good place to start, and then progressively build a slightly more complex model. So what you can do with an IO model is to look at the changes in final demands, or basically model what would happen if you believe that there would be an increase in demand in a certain sector of, say, 10%. And then you can you make a few assumptions and you use some matrix multiplication. I'm not going to go into all of the details, but if anyone does ever want to know, I'm more than happy to talk through it. So you have to make assumptions in the model. Basically, one assumption is that there's a passive supply side, or that supply is completely elastic. So for any increase in demand, if you assume that the demand for agriculture increases by 10%, there's an assumption there in the model that the supply of all the goods and services that produce agriculture can increase. There's no limits to the amount of the supply can either increase or decrease within the model. Another thing that you assume within the model is that there's sort of constant returns to scale. So where we had these inputs to the primary and construction sector, basically what you assume is that this ratio of inputs, so say this is roughly about 40% or whatever. Yeah, so say this is roughly about 40%. You then assume that as a proportion of output, that the primary and construction sector has to be an input. So if there's an increase in final demand here for primary and construction, then you'll have not only the initial 10% increase in that area, but then you'll have a feed-through effect in the economy, where you then, all of the inputs that go into that sector then have to increase as well. Does that sort of make sense? I don't know if I've got a worked example here or not. But basically, yeah, the model tries to capture all of the multiplier effects that you would have in the economy. So when you increase the demand for one sector, then not only is there an increase in that initial kind of direct effect, but you also have feed-through effects. So when you increase that, you have to increase all the inputs that go into that, and then they have to be produced, so you have to then increase those inputs, and there's a sort of incremental increase in the amount of inputs that you have to put, you know, to actually achieve that level of final demand. So yeah, so you have sort of the direct effect. So if there's an increase of 10 million, you'll have that initial increase in 10 million of output, but you also have indirect effects, which will be the sort of incremental effects. And then you can also calculate, so those, you're able to then calculate all of those and sum them basically for a single sector. So you can sort of rank different sectors of the economy based upon their output effect on the economy, which I'll show you in a minute. You can also include this, and so the sum, of those will be this type 1 output multiplier, which will save, you know, the output multiplier for, again, say agriculture is 1.3, which will say that for a 1% increase in the output or the final demand of agriculture, there would be an overall increase of 1.3% through the whole economy. Try and give a better example at some point. And you can then also do what's called a type 2 multiplier, where you endogenize household spending into the economy as well. So here, as part of final demand, this would maybe be split out into households, governments, exports. And you can actually, and really only this part of the database would be considered endogenous to the model, and then you're looking at the changes in the final demand part. But if you can take parts of that and endogenize it into the model to see the differences. So we have also the induced effect. So if households were to spend all of their extra money that they receive through the increase in output, then you can sort of capture that as well. And there's a number of sort of newer literature which looks at environmental multiplier analysis, which has been quite popular, where basically you link things like emissions of different greenhouse gases to output within the model. So the table I used was a UK table for 2004, which was 123 by 123 sectors, which is the normal kind of level of application. I then used environmental accounts from DEFRA, I think. Yeah. And had to do a bit of kind of matching between sectors, because the level of data that you receive for this. There's a lot of different data out there, and a lot of it doesn't quite match up, so you kind of have to do a bit of analysis there. So the idea though is that obviously there's 123 sectors. I could stand here and present 120, results for 123 different sectors. It would take us all day. So normally you would try to aggregate the models slightly somehow, and that was what I was wanting to do. Really to aggregate it, but with not just randomly try to really pick out which sectors were important. So I wanted to try to pick out the EU emissions trading scheme, main sectors that are covered by that, and I wanted to have some sort of level of aggregation in the electricity sector, because both of those are obviously important for UK emissions. I could give you a background on this, but I should maybe just skip through it. I take it everybody's quite aware of how emissions trading schemes work. So this was the allocated emissions of EU ETS. As you can see, so combustion installations are very have the most sort of emissions allocated to them. So that was what, 2008. There was a total of 213 megatons of CO2, 150 million of which were through mostly large electricity producers. You then have things like oil refineries, carbons, iron, steel, the rest of these sort of sectors. So I wanted to try to identify them in the model. There's a few problems with this. First of all, nobody thought about modelling when they introduced the EU emissions trading. No one thought about, whether the data would be useful for any of us. So rather than it being completely sectoral, they've tried to just induce policy on the largest emitters. So some sectors are covered partially. Some sectors, basically large electricity coal producers and gas producers, all of them will be covered by the scheme. But some other things like food and drink, there's a lot of distilleries that have combustion installations which will be covered by the scheme. There's a number in different manufacturing sectors, that sort of thing. So I did first of all try to attempt to do it sort of bottom up in terms of the coverage of it, but it was going to be pretty impossible to do accurately with a model, so I sort of had to come up with a sort of rule of thumb, which in the end was that there was roughly in this year there's roughly about 49% of UK total CO2 emissions covered by the EU emissions trading scheme. So I tried to match an aggregate figure in the model. I took the sectors which I knew were wholly covered by the emissions trading scheme and added them in to see what sort of total I had, and then I started trying to add in other sectors in the model that had partial kind of coverage to come to some sort of level of aggregation. So these were the sectors which I then considered traded sectors within the model: mining, quarrying, food and drink, textiles. You can see them there. So these are the type 1 and type 2 output multipliers for the traded sectors. So as I kind of said before, these tend to mean that if there's a 1% increase in final demand for these sectors, then this is the actual overall increase in output in the economy. So if, as you can see, electricity is the highest ranked sector here for these type 1 output multipliers. So if there was a 10 million increase in demand, household demand for electricity, you would see a 23 million increase in output in the economy overall. It's roughly what that's saying. And you can break that down into what each individual sector would be. So the type 1 is where households are exogenous to the model, and type 2 is where households are. So that assumes that there's no extra household spending. When there's an increase in final demand, households their expenditure stays the same. This is assuming that they spend the exact same as they did previously and there's no savings in the model. So in practice, or in real life, you're going to have something that's somewhere between these two effects, really. You're sort of assuming two ends of the spectrum for these results. So these are for the traded sectors, and these are the output multipliers for the non-traded sectors within the model. So you have some large emitters still there, like agriculture, forestry. You've got all your transport sectors, and you can see these don't have quite as large. The ranking on these tend to be a lot less, in the sense that they're not as the linkages to the economy aren't as great for a lot of these sectors. But when you endogenize households, they tend to be a lot more labour intensive, these types of sectors. I guess, which makes sense. You would expect the largest emitting sectors to be the more capital intensive, and you would expect this kind of service sectors and stuff to be more labour intensive. Does anyone get any questions at this point in time? I see a lot of blank faces. I should really have just chosen one of these and gone into detail. I'm kind of flying through it, I realise. But anyone get any questions? No? Anyone want to go and get more food? Is that why? Feel free to do that. So I tried to give us kind of aggregate result of these, which is that the traded sector as a whole has an output multiplier of roughly about 1.88. So for a 100 million increase in final demand for those sectors, you're going to have 188 million increase in output overall in the economy, and the non-traded sectors are slightly less, 1.17 million. But the labour intensity you can see in the type 2 multipliers, which shows you that you can't quite determine which is going to be have the larger effect in the economy if there's increases in demand for certain types of goods and services. But the main idea, really, you don't need to pay attention too much to these results. It was just some analysis after I tried to actually identify which sectors were traded and non-traded within the model. And these are some CO2 output multipliers for the traded sectors. So, within the model, if there's an increase of 1 million in final demand for ceramic goods, then you have an extra 600 tons of CO2 increased within the model. And you can rank these as well. And again, I guess a headline result would be that the electricity sector is by far the most, well, not quite by far, cement, lime and plaster are both very emissions intensive within the economy. So this is probably the first part where anyone's actually going, okay, yeah, this is related to us in any way whatsoever. Yeah, emissions. And these are for the non-traded sectors. So as you can see, their emissions are considerably less for an increase in thermal demand, which shows at least they sort of got.
Yeah, for the production of electricity, does that include, for instance, that we will go towards more renewable in the future and this carbon emission should decrease in this sector?
So it doesn't, the model only works for that 1 year. There's no
compensation.
There's no, it's a very sort of, what would the short-term results be if all of a sudden we had to increase demand for electricity, say it was freezing all year long, we had to increase electricity now by a certain percentage, what would the short-run results of that be? But you would then, there's no fundamental changes to the economy or technology within these results. So these are for the non-traded sectors, which are a lot less within the model. So the other thing I wanted to do, you basically, the main problem with using this type of model for energy work is that the electricity sector, even though it's quite a large sector of the UK economy, it's only considered within the economic accounts as one sector. So you have production, generation basically, and then distribution. Everything is given within that. The matrix. You're given the electricity sector and all of the details on what each sector, what sectors the electricity sector purchases from, and then you've got all of the electricity sector's purchases as well. But it's not broken down into different technologies, so you can't really. There has been a lot of work done previously on this area, but I thought a lot of it was kind of weak in the sense that there's no you're not able to substitute, I guess, between technologies at all within a lot of the economic models. And that's what I wanted to do later on with the carbon tax. There'd be no point in me introducing a carbon tax where I just taxed electricity, because you're not going to see any interesting results from that. You're not going to actually achieve what happens in practice, where there's hopefully, abatement and substitution as well. So I tried to break down what I'd previously done there into different technologies. Basically, again, try to get enough data to be able to do it from a bottom-up perspective, but very difficult to get a lot of the electricity generators to give information on where they purchase, where all of their yearly purchases are, especially for more new technologies as well. The data for, I did manage to get hold of some data for the wind sector, and it didn't work at all. It was looked about twice as large as it should have, and a lot of it. The other thing that in trying to do this, you see that of the revenues, of the output of a sector, like wind, roughly about half of its revenues are all coming. Well, this was 2004, but half of its revenues were through subsidies. So I tried to basically then have to split it down based on some assumptions and what data I had, to disaggregate the sector from just one economic sector where you have just electricity and all its purchases and sales, into lots of different technologies and all of their purchases and sales. And then attach the environmental accounts to those sectors as well. So where previously we just had an increase, if there was an increase in output of 1 million, you had, I think electricity was something like 8,000 tonnes of CO2 were produced for an increase in electricity. You can see here that figure is basically decomposed into all of the generating technologies now. So you can see that coal and gas and oil, as you would expect, to be the largest within the model. Right, so where are we? So this is then the actual modelling, proper modelling part that came around to. So you can extend the sort of the original I/O database and model to create what's called a computable general equilibrium model, which actually includes the supply side of the economy, which you previously didn't do. So previously we assumed that there was a completely elastic supply, so we take away that assumption and we allow for substitution between technologies as well within a CGE model. And it's basically, you use the input-output table that I showed you before and some extra data on national accounts to create a matrix, a SAM matrix, a social accounting matrix. And then there's a set of equations that you then are able to calibrate an equilibrium. It's basically an equilibrium model. You have an equilibrium in that base year, and then you're able to introduce a policy shock of some sort and compare the results against the base year equilibrium. So you're assuming that the economy is in equilibrium in your base year, which I guess is one of the kind of limiting. But I think what energy systems can roughly does that as well. So I mean, my initial idea then was to look at how to achieve if the Committee on Climate Change were delegated policy instruments such as the carbon tax, which would hopefully reduce uncertainty, which wouldn't be incorporated in the model at all. What would the kind of multisectoral effects and overall macroeconomic effects be of achieving that? So it's a 34% reduction in emissions by 2020. But a few other ideas which I haven't quite looked at yet, I'm hopefully going to. The UK is introducing the carbon price floor next year, which hopefully the model will be able to capture as well, because it's basically a tax on the sales of fossil fuels to electricity producers, and which is going to hopefully supposed to underpin the price of the EU emissions trading scheme. And then I was concerned with if you introduce a tax, what do you do with the revenues of the tax? So there's potential benefits of using the revenues of the tax to reduce other taxes, other distortionary taxes. So if you've increased a carbon tax, you may well be able to reduce things like income tax, and then that would benefit employment. People would be more willing to work, would be more competitive within the economy, and you could actually potentially have what's called a double dividend, where you reduce emissions and actually increase welfare, or a proxy for welfare such as GDP. Because the problem with introducing a tax is that most people go, well, it's going to make people worse off. You may be helping the environment, but we're going to reduce output by whatever 1%. But if you using these models, CG models, it's possible to look at, is that necessarily the case? How much is output going to be affected, and which specific sectors of the economy are going to be affected when you introduce such a tax? Yeah, so this was just explaining the double dividend a bit. So the idea is yes, you're introducing a carbon tax, you would expect definitely to see a reduction in emissions. But what is the effect going to be on things like GDP and employment? And there's a number of different effects. I guess if anyone wants to talk about that after, we can maybe go into it. There's a number of different effects on the economy that you would expect from recycling the revenues. So I looked at 3 different scenarios. One where basically the revenues are taken and not put back into the economy. So I guess my theoretical understanding of that would be something like it's taken by the EU or something, and not spent. But it gives a good kind of baseline scenario. And then the other one's an increase in government expenditure. So that all of the tax is what we call revenue neutral, in the sense that you take the tax, but then it's all put back into the economy, either through government expenditure, or it could be put back into the economy through reducing other taxes. So this is the model. There's 25 sectors in the model. Given what I did before, 10 of them are EU emissions trading scheme. There's 9 electricity generation technologies, and hopefully capture the sort of the differences in emissions intensities across all of these sectors. Firms are cost minimizers within the model. Consumption, it's dependent upon population, average income, consumer prices. Real wage in the models inversely related to the unemployment rate. The model, actually I don't think there is any migration within these scenarios. The model, basically the capital stocks are updated each period, so you run the model on a sort of period by period basis, and you can run it over say 30 years, and each year the capital stock, the model recalibrates and updates the capital stock each year. Basically I wanted to look at the effect of a tax on a carbon tax, or a tax on fossil fuels based upon their carbon content. The production structure of each sector, apart from the electricity supply sector, all looks like this. So you have the output of each individual sector. Say, going back to agriculture. So the output of agriculture is determined by combination of intermediate inputs and value added. And there's a parameter there, what's a constant elasticity of substitution parameter, which you state within the model, which allows substitution between those 2 inputs. And so at each of these points, here, you're going to have parameters which allow you to substitute between the 2 inputs, which are normally just kind of calibrated from the kind of econometric literature. So every sector looks roughly like that. These would be all of the non-energy, so there's going to be 14 or 15 sectors here who would feed into this. But I assume that all sectors purchase electricity from an electricity transmission sector, or like a distribution sector, because it's difficult trying to model electricity within these types of economic models is quite difficult to do realistically, because you don't have, agriculture wouldn't be able to choose what type of electricity it's purchasing from. The normal way it would be set up would be it could just choose between all of the different types of it. Normally the models don't even include a differentiation between the types of electricity. You've just got an electricity sector and that's it, and nobody has to worry about it. But trying to actually incorporate some sort of realistic electricity sector within this model basically assumed that every sector purchases from an electricity transmission sector, but that the electricity supply or transmission sector has a more complicated production structure, where it is able to purchase from all of the other technologies. So, some results. Here we go. So I introduced a £22 per tonne of CO2 carbon tax in the UK, and these are the three. This is where the revenues are externally recycled. This is where they're recycled through a reduction in income tax, and this is where they're recycled through an increase in government expenditure. The short run is after 1 year. The long run, I think, the long run is after, so the model was 2004 running through to 2000. It ran further, but I'm giving the long run results as 2020 because that was the year we were concerned with achieving the reduction in emissions. So basically the tax was set to try to make sure that in 2020 there was a reduction of about 35%. I know that the Committee on Climate Change, the carbon budget's set for 34%, but though I was only modelling CO2 within this, and the CO2 reduction in CO2 is going to have to be slightly higher. I calculated what that would have to be. It'd have to be about a 35% reduction if it's going to be in line with all the other gases. So you can see that in each of those instances, apart, well, not quite the income tax case, but there or thereabouts, emissions are reduced by 35% compared to the baseline year. That's what those results are saying. You can see here that there's a decrease in the income tax of these percentages compared to the base year, and this is the effect on GDP. So you can see that where there's no recycling and there's just a tax introduced, you have a reduction in GDP of roughly about 1.2%. But where you then reduce income tax, it has a lessening effect on GDP.